I steered the bland, charcoal gray rental sedan, a necessary concession to anonymity, off the main highway and onto the familiar winding streets of Northern Virginia suburbia. The transition was immediate and jarring. Just hours ago, I was reviewing high-level operational reports in a sterile, windowless office. Now, I was enveloped by the suffocating quiet of wealth and conformity. Every lawn was perfectly manicured, every mailbox identical, every house a testament to a conventional success I had consciously rejected a decade prior. I pulled the car into the brick-paved driveway of my father's house. The scent of freshly cut grass and expensive mulch hit me, a heavy, cloying fragrance that always felt alien after the sharp, clean efficiency of the Pacific Ocean air or the dry, high-altitude clarity of deployment zones. This air here felt thick, stagnant, and laden with unspoken expectations. I was home for Clara's college graduation, yet I knew with absolute certainty that I wasn't truly home. I was an anomaly, a highly specialized tool dropped into a domestic landscape where my function was entirely misunderstood. I sat in the idling car for a full minute, calibrating myself. I was Lieutenant Commander Sarah, U.S. Navy, trained to manage global logistics and lead teams through high-stakes scenarios. Here, I was merely Bob's daughter who joined the military. The uniform, which was usually my shield and my identity, was packed away in my suitcase, a tactical mistake, perhaps. I had chosen civilian clothes for the dinner, hoping to blend, but now I realized my tailored suit would feel more like camouflage, stripping me of the institutional authority that was my natural defense. Stepping out of the car, I felt the familiar tightening in my chest, a physical manifestation of the need to justify my decade of absence. I wasn't running away. I was serving, learning, and achieving on a scale that dwarfed the value of this entire neighborhood. The front door opened before I could reach it. Vivian, my stepmother, emerged, framed by the expensive oak and glass. She approached me with that specific brand of saccharine enthusiasm that always felt like a thinly veiled inspection. Her smile didn't quite reach her eyes. It was a performance, polished and rehearsed for the neighbors who might be watching. "Sarah, look at you. We were just saying how wonderful it is that you could make time for us," she chirped, leaning in for a brief, non-committal hug that smelled faintly of expensive perfume and judgment. "It's good to be here, Vivian. I wouldn't miss Clara's graduation," I replied, keeping my voice level, professional, and entirely devoid of emotional vulnerability. I was already deploying my strategy: detachment. The next few hours were spent in a slow, agonizing rotation of civil pretense. Vivian immediately set about repositioning me within the family narrative. She introduced me to a neighbor as our traveler, someone who had run off to see the world, rather than the officer currently serving in the U.S. Navy. I observed her subtle manipulations, filing them away with the detached precision I used for threat assessment. When my father's business partner, Mr. Henderson, asked about my current assignment, genuinely impressed by my rank, Vivian swooped in with the practiced speed of a trained predator. "Oh yes, Sarah is so adventurous," she interjected, placing a proprietary hand on Mr. Henderson's arm. "But we're just so relieved Clara chose a path that keeps her close. A sensible business degree, you know. Something stable." Stable. The word hung in the air, a deliberate barb meant to imply my life was unstable, reckless, or perhaps simply less valuable than Clara's perfectly conventional trajectory. I felt the familiar heat rise, but I suppressed it instantly. I was trained for patience. I had sat through hours of classified briefings without flinching. I could certainly endure Vivian's petty assaults. I retreated mentally, pulling up the internal file on my own qualifications, my armor. I reflected on the 2 Navy-funded master's degrees I'd earned. The first, in strategic logistics, demanded a relentless focus on efficiency, risk mitigation, and managing multi-million-dollar supply chains across volatile zones. The second, in advanced systems management, required a deep understanding of complex defense technology and the stringent security protocols mandated by the Department of Defense. I remembered the grueling hours, the competitive difficulty of those programs, The sheer mental stamina required to maintain a top-secret clearance while simultaneously leading teams and meeting academic demands. These were not degrees earned through casual effort. They were forged in pressure and professional necessity. They were qualifications that placed me in the top percentile of strategic thinkers in my field. Yet, here, they meant nothing. Vivian didn't see the lieutenant commander who commanded respect and responsibility. She only saw the uniform that kept me away from her perfect family photos, the daughter who chose service over suburban compliance. She viewed my accomplishments not as achievements, but as evidence of my flaw, my unwillingness to stay small and predictable. My father, Bob, moved through the house with a nervous energy that was equally irritating. He was a man defined by compromise, an expert in silent betrayal. He would catch my eye occasionally across the room, offering a quick, helpless look of apology, a nonverbal acknowledgement that he saw Vivian's campaign, but lacked the spine to intervene. His silence was his signature move, the reason I had learned to seek my validation outside the confines of this house. I watched Clara. My half-sister was genuinely sweet, oblivious to the emotional warfare being waged around her. She was excited, nervous, and utterly focused on the future laid out for her, an internship at a regional accounting firm, a path Vivian had engineered and celebrated with almost religious fervor. I genuinely wished her well. Her path was hers, and while it was one I wouldn't trade my life for, it was valid. The tension in the air was building toward the culmination of the evening, the formal dinner at the country club. I knew the dinner was Vivian's stage, her opportunity to parade her successful, compliant daughter before their social circle. I was just the slightly embarrassing supporting cast member, the necessary inclusion that served to highlight Clara's sensible choices. As I dressed for the evening, a dark, perfectly tailored Italian wool suit that felt stiff and unfamiliar compared to the comfortable authority of my khakis, I made a promise to myself. I would remain detached, professional, and silent. I would offer my toast, express my genuine happiness for Clara, and navigate the evening like a high-stakes diplomatic mission. I would absorb Vivian's passive-aggressive jabs without reaction. My sole mission was to be present, maintain the facade of familial civility, and leave before the resentment, which was already curdling in the corners of the living room, could fully spoil the night. I was Sarah, the officer. I would treat this evening like an operation, defined objectives, minimal expenditure of emotional resources, and a clean, swift exit. I would not allow their small-minded world to diminish the weight of my own worth. I zipped my suitcase, ensuring my ID and orders were securely stored. Soon, I would be back in the life where competence was the only currency that mattered. But first, I had to survive the ritual of false praise. I took a deep breath, squaring my shoulders. The engagement had begun. The air inside the country club's private banquet room was thick with the scent of expensive perfume and the low, self-satisfied hum of suburban prosperity. It was a space designed for the public affirmation of success, featuring heavy velvet drapes, crystal chandeliers, and white linen tables set with surgical precision. To me, it felt like a museum exhibit dedicated to things I had deliberately chosen to leave behind. I immediately regretted my wardrobe choice. My decision to wear a charcoal gray tailored civilian suit, my attempt to blend in and minimize my footprint, had backfired. The suit was impeccably cut, but it lacked the inherent authority of my service dress blues. In uniform, I am an institution. I carry the weight of the Navy on my shoulders, and people treat me accordingly. In this suit, I was merely a well-dressed woman, stripped of my rank and the protective barrier of my profession. I felt exposed, like a vital piece of equipment left uncovered in a sandstorm. I navigated the room like a tactical exercise. Objective 1, locate Clara and offer sincere congratulations. Objective 2, maintain distance from Vivian. Objective 3, monitor my father. Clara looked genuinely happy, radiant in her cap and gown, which she had insisted on wearing for the photos before the dinner began. Her achievement was real, and my pride for her was untainted. She had worked hard for her business degree, charting a sensible, predictable course, which was exactly what this environment valued. I offered her a hug that felt solid and true, a brief moment of warmth amidst the glacial formality. The rest of the room was a minefield of small talk. I shook hands with my father's partners, lawyers, CFOs, and real estate developers, men and women who understood the language of responsibility and high-stakes finance. When they learned my rank, a few eyebrows lifted in genuine respect. "Lieutenant Commander, that's impressive. What kind of operations do you manage?" asked a silver-haired man who introduced himself as a corporate auditor. Before I could answer with the carefully curated, unclassified summary I always kept ready, Vivian materialized at my elbow. Her smile was a flawless mask, wide and aggressively pleasant. "Oh, Sarah's just back from one of her many adventures," Vivian interjected, placing a proprietary hand on the auditor's arm, subtly turning him away from me. She emphasized adventures with a dismissive air, transforming a decade of rigorous professional service into a frivolous gap year. "It's so wonderful that Clara has chosen a reliable, traditional path right here in the area. No need to run off to the other side of the world, thank goodness." The auditor, sensing the delicate family dynamic, offered a weak smile and quickly excused himself. The interaction was a perfect microcosm of my existence here. Any professional accomplishment I possessed was immediately minimized, reframed, and discarded. I felt the familiar cold pressure building in my chest, the need to breathe shallowly to prevent the rage from escalating into something unprofessional. I reminded myself, detachment is key. Do not engage. I retreated to the edge of the room, sipping water and observing the dynamics. My gaze repeatedly drifted to my father, Bob. He was positioned near the head table, exchanging pleasantries, but his posture was tight, his movements jerky. Every time Vivian executed one of her subtle character assassinations, a whispered comment, a pointed laugh, Bob's head would snap toward me. I caught his eye. His expression was a familiar blend of helplessness and apology. It was the look of a man who knew he was failing, but who lacked the moral courage to intervene. That look, I realized, was his signature act of quiet betrayal. He saw the decade of hard work, the promotions, the sacrifices, being reduced to a childish whim, and he chose silence. It was a failure I had long since factored into my operational plan. I expected nothing from him, and therefore I could not be disappointed. His weakness was no longer a source of pain, but a predictable environmental variable. The dinner service began, a protracted affair involving multiple courses and meticulous silverware changes. I ate methodically, focusing on the texture and temperature of the food, using the mundane process of eating to anchor myself in the present and avoid reacting to the continuous, low-level buzz of trivial conversation around me. Then came the moment for the toasts. I was scheduled first, a role I suspected Vivian had assigned me precisely so she could follow and clean up any perceived awkwardness. I stood up. I placed my glass on the table and adjusted my jacket. I walked to the podium, my movements practiced, my gait betraying none of the internal churn. I looked out at the assembled group, family, friends, and colleagues, and acknowledged them with a brief professional nod. My voice, when I spoke, was clear and projected perfectly, honed by years of briefing admirals and delivering mission objectives in high-stress environments. I kept the toast short, concise, and focused entirely on Clara. "To Clara," I began, raising my glass. "Your dedication, persistence, and commitment to your goals are inspiring. These are the qualities that define success, regardless of the path you choose. I wish you a future filled with accomplishment and happiness." It was genuine. It was brief. It was impeccable. I sat down, feeling a momentary, sharp sense of relief. Mission accomplished. I had executed my task without incident, offered sincere congratulations, and avoided giving any fuel to the surrounding pettiness. I thought, perhaps foolishly, that I had successfully navigated the minefield. But the silence was deceptive. Vivian rose immediately after I resumed my seat. She did not walk to the podium. She glided, performing a slow, dramatic sweep of the room before settling in front of the microphone. She was wearing a dress the color of expensive champagne, and her smile was now wider, brighter, and entirely focused on me. I felt a sudden, cold prickle of dread, a specific sensation I recognize from operational briefings when intelligence suggests an unforeseen, high-probability threat. My detachment fractured. My professional defenses, which had held steady all evening, suddenly recognized the shift in the atmosphere. The game was changing. Vivian adjusted the microphone, tapping it unnecessarily. Her eyes locked onto mine, holding my gaze with a predatory confidence. I knew, with the tactical certainty of a decade spent anticipating enemy moves, that the ritual of false praise was over. The attack phase was about to begin. I tightened my grip on the stem of my water glass, bracing myself for impact. The air in the private dining room, already heavy with the scent of expensive wine and forced politeness, seemed to solidify around me. Vivian stood at the microphone, a vision in emerald silk, basking in the glow of the chandelier. I had watched her approach the podium, her smile too wide, her posture radiating artificial grace. This is it, I thought, the cold certainty settling in my gut. I knew the ritual of false praise was over. The attack phase had begun. She started harmlessly enough, perhaps even genuinely. "Clara is the light of this family," Vivian cooed, her voice carrying effortlessly over the low murmur of the guests. "We are so incredibly proud of the choices she has made, the sensible, grounded path she has chosen." I nodded politely, raising my water glass in a silent, internal toast to my half-sister. Clara deserved all the praise. Her path was sensible. It was safe. It was exactly what this community valued: a straight line from a prestigious university to a predictable, well-compensated life in corporate finance. I felt no resentment toward Clara, only genuine affection and a quiet understanding that our worlds had diverged irrevocably years ago. Vivian continued, her tone shifting subtly, gaining a brittle edge. "We see so many young people today chasing frivolous dreams, or perhaps running away from responsibility." Her eyes flickered toward me, a swift, practiced movement that only I, trained to catch movement in peripheral vision, could truly register. "We are so grateful that Clara chose a traditional, successful path." The emphasis on traditional was the first subtle needle. It implied my decade of service, the deployments, the specialized training, the sheer weight of responsibility I carried daily, was somehow untraditional, a deviation, or worse, a childish rebellion. I felt the familiar tightening in my chest, the practiced response of ignoring the slight. I was Sarah, the professional, the officer. I would not engage in this suburban skirmish. I would remain detached, a silent observer in my own life's theater. Then she pivoted. The transition was flawless, rehearsed. It was a tactical maneuver designed to inflict maximum public damage while maintaining a veneer of maternal concern. "And of course," Vivian continued, her voice dripping with artificial sweetness, "we are happy to have Sarah here tonight. We know she tries her best, truly, we do." She paused, letting the pity in her voice hang in the air like a noxious vapor. Her gaze locked onto mine again, direct and triumphant. "But we hope that now, seeing Clara's stable future, Sarah can finally stop being so jealous." The word hung there. Jealousy. The silence that followed was absolute, terrifying. It wasn't the polite silence of anticipation. It was the sudden, shocked cessation of all ambient sound. The scraping of a chair, the clink of silverware, the nervous coughs. Everything stopped, freezing the entire room in a tableau of disbelief. I felt the blood drain from my face, not in shame, but in a surge of cold, blinding realization. Jealousy? Me? The insult was not merely personal, it was a profound, public dismissal of every single sacrifice I had made. It suggested that my dedication, my specialized education, my rank, my security clearance, the very uniform I wore on a daily basis, All of it was merely a compensatory reaction to emotional inadequacy. It reduced my decade of strategic, high-stakes service to petty sibling rivalry over who had the better entry-level job. My mind, trained for rapid threat assessment and operational response, went instantly silent. The emotional part of me, the Sarah who still craved her father's approval, the one who remembered the sting of childhood exclusion, was momentarily paralyzed. But the officer, Lieutenant Commander Sarah, took over. I saw the reactions unfold in slow motion, cataloging them like data points on a radar screen. First, the guests, the professionals, the CFOs, the law partners, the high-level executives who knew the cost of stability and success, looked genuinely confused, their expressions shifting from polite curiosity to awkward discomfort. They were trying to reconcile the image of a high-ranking naval officer with the suggested portrait of a spiteful, envious older sister. Vivian had created a narrative rupture. Second, Vivian herself. Her smile was still plastered on her face, but her eyes held a smug, vindictive satisfaction. She had landed the blow exactly where she wanted it, in front of the audience that mattered most to her, the people whose good opinion she valued above all else. She believed she had won the social battlefield. Third, my father. Bob. He twitched, his face pale with sudden, horrifying shame. He started to mumble something, a weak, defensive noise, a half-formed, "Vivian, please," but the sound died in his throat. His attempted defense was too little, too late. His silence throughout the years had been his signature betrayal, and even now, facing an open, malicious attack on his own daughter, he could barely muster a whisper. I didn't need his half-hearted intervention. In fact, his weakness only hardened my resolve. In that frozen moment, I realized the gravity of the situation. This was not a private spat that could be ignored or smoothed over later. Vivian had issued a public challenge to my professional integrity. She had used this platform, this formal celebration, to openly slander my character and dismiss my career as a failure born of envy. And in my world, in the high-stakes environment where I operated, silence in the face of slander was surrender. It was tacit agreement. My training kicked in. I felt the surge of blinding fury transform instantly into a cold, diamond-hard clarity. It was the same feeling I got when a critical system failed during a complex operation. The immediate cessation of panic, the focus on the mission, the absolute necessity of calculated, precise action. I stood up. I did not spring to my feet in anger. I rose slowly, deliberately, the movement measured and controlled. The tailored civilian suit suddenly felt like the wrong uniform, but my posture was pure navy. I pushed my chair back gently, the soft sound of the velvet-covered wood scraping the carpet echoing loudly in the shocked silence. My father, seeing my movement, reached out a hand, his eyes wide with panic. "Sarah, don't," he whispered, finally finding his voice, but only to beg for my compliance. I held up my hand, a gesture of absolute command, stopping him mid-sentence. I didn't look at him. My focus was entirely on Vivian, who, for the first time, looked slightly unnerved. Her triumphant smile faltered, replaced by a flicker of uncertainty. She had expected rage, tears, or perhaps a hasty retreat. She had not expected this controlled, tactical silence. I walked toward the microphone, my steps deliberate, echoing the rhythm of a prepared march. I felt the eyes of every person in the room drilling into my back, but I ignored them. My objective was the podium. Vivian attempted to salvage the moment, trying to reassert her control. "Well, Sarah, I think we should let Clara speak now, darling," she chirped nervously, trying to sound authoritative, like a host concluding a segment. I reached the podium and placed my hand firmly on the microphone stand, covering hers. My touch was not aggressive, but it was unyielding. She drew her hand back instantly, instinctively recognizing the boundary of power. I looked out over the room, ensuring I made eye contact with the key players, my father's business associates, the people who understood concepts like asset management, and strategic planning. I was no longer the daughter, the sibling, or the guest. I was Lieutenant Commander Sarah, and I was about to execute a necessary professional intervention. I took a slow, deep breath, the air cold in my lungs. I was preparing to dismantle the threat. My voice, when it finally broke the silence, was low, steady, and utterly devoid of emotion or heat. It was the voice of command, the voice I used to debrief admirals and issue orders under pressure. It was the sound of absolute, icy resolve. "Vivian," I began, using only her name, stripping away any pretense of familial address. "I am thrilled for Clara. However, I must correct the implication that I am capable of jealousy." I paused, letting the weight of the statement settle. The silence returned, thicker this time, heavy with expectation. The stage was set. I was ready to deploy the facts. This was not a negotiation. This was a strategic correction of the public record. My decade of service demanded nothing less than absolute precision. I had been insulted, and now I would respond with competence. The only way to counter such pettiness was with unassailable, quantified worth. The battle had just begun, and I was taking command. The air in the private dining room had coagulated, turning heavy and silent, pressing down on the polished silver and the crystal glasses. Vivian's voice, which moments before had sliced through the room with saccharine cruelty, was now ringing in the silence like a dropped bell. The word, jealous, still hung there, an accusation so baseless, so fundamentally ignorant of my reality, that it had stripped away my last layer of familial obligation. I moved with the deliberate, measured pace of someone conducting a damage assessment in a high-risk zone. My father, Bob, had started to push himself up from his chair, a weak, apologetic sound caught in his throat. But I raised my hand, a small, almost imperceptible gesture, and he froze, recognizing the command authority in the movement. It wasn't the daughter dismissing the father. It was the officer signaling a halt to an unnecessary complication. I walked the 10 feet to the microphone at the podium. Each step was a conscious effort to channel the blinding heat of my fury into the cold, strategic precision I used when briefing a flag officer. I wasn't reacting emotionally. I was executing a tactical countermaneuver. I didn't rush. I didn't stomp. I simply moved with an economy of effort that drew every eye in the room. I reached the podium and adjusted the microphone slightly, a small, professional gesture that somehow seemed to recontextualize the entire setting. This was no longer a celebratory dinner. It was a formal hearing, and I was about to submit evidence. My eyes met Vivian's. Her smile was still plastered on her face, but it was starting to crack around the edges. She saw the change in me, the shift from the detached, polite visitor to the professional who knew exactly how to dismantle an opposing argument. "Vivian," I began. My voice was low, absolutely steady, and amplified just enough by the microphone to carry the weight of my rank and experience across the silent room. I did not use mom or any familial term. I used her name, formal and distant. I am genuinely happy for Clara's success. However, I paused, letting the word hang. I must execute a strategic correction regarding your implication. I let my gaze sweep across the room, addressing the audience, the assembled business associates, the lawyers, the bankers, the people who understood quantifiable success and professional metrics. I bypassed the family entirely. The concept that I, personally, could harbor jealousy toward my sister's educational or professional trajectory is fundamentally incompatible with my operational reality, I stated, using terminology that immediately separated my world from theirs. I could see the confusion on some faces, but others, the ones in tailored suits who dealt with mergers, acquisitions, and compliance, were leaning forward. They recognized the language of high-stakes environments. My career path, chosen a decade ago, was not a running off or an emotional whim. It was a calculated, competitive entry into one of the world's most demanding professional structures. I continued, my eyes returning to Vivian, who was now gripping the back of her chair, her knuckles white. I began the recitation of facts, treating my life not as a source of pride, but as a series of verifiable performance metrics. Vivian suggested that Clara choosing a traditional stable path was somehow superior to mine. Let us examine the data points that define stability and professional rigor, I said. My service required specialized advanced degrees. I hold not one, but 2 master's degrees, entirely funded by the U.S. Navy and earned concurrently with full-time operational duties. I listed them, making sure the titles sounded as bureaucratic and demanding as they were. A Master of Science in Strategic Logistics Management from the Naval Postgraduate School, and a subsequent Master of Advanced Systems Management, focusing specifically on global supply chain security and high-risk asset deployment. I watched as the CFO seated near my father slowly nodded. He understood the gravity of 2 fully funded, military-mandated graduate degrees. These were not optional qualifications. They were mandated by the Department of Defense to prepare me for my current responsibilities as a lieutenant commander, I explained. I emphasized the rank, letting the title resonate. The curriculum demanded specialized knowledge in global resource allocation, high-level threat assessment, and the management of organizational budgets that, combined, exceed the annual GDP of several small nations. I paused, allowing the sheer scale of the comparison to sink in. My annual budget oversight was likely larger than the combined net worth of everyone in that room, including the country club itself. To complete these programs successfully, I was required to maintain a security clearance, a clearance level that allows me access to information classified at a level far above the pay grade of anyone else seated at this table, I stated, my tone dry and factual. That clearance is not a trophy. It is a prerequisite for my daily work, requiring constant, rigorous background checks and accountability that extends to every aspect of my life. The silence was deafening now. It was a different kind of silence than before. Not shock at an insult, but awe at the sheer, cold magnitude of the professional chasm I had just revealed. The triviality of Vivian's suburban concerns, the manicured lawn, the country club membership, was being obliterated by the weight of global strategic planning. Vivian's face had gone from smug to a sickly, pale white. She tried to interrupt, a small, choked sound escaping her lips, but I cut her off with a slight shake of my head, never raising my voice. I was in command of this moment, and I would not yield the floor. Let's address the concept of stability, which was Vivian's main point of comparison, I continued, moving into the final, most devastating phase of my counterattack, the financial metrics. Clara's degree is commendable, and I wish her every success in her entry-level role. However, my education was entirely financed by the American taxpayer, resulting in 0 personal educational debt. 0, I repeated, knowing the crushing weight of student loans was a shared reality for many of the younger guests. Furthermore, as a lieutenant commander in the United States Navy, my compensation package, including base pay, housing allowance, and specialized bonuses commensurate with my security clearance and operational deployment requirements, places my annual income at approximately 4 times the average starting salary for a recent graduate in Clara's field. I delivered the number with the precision of a bullet hitting its target. I didn't stop there. I needed to ensure the professional guests understood the institutional difference in leverage. My position carries guaranteed health and retirement benefits, guaranteed compensation increases based on a quantifiable performance metric, rank advancement, and housing security that far exceeds the volatility of the private sector job market, I stated, looking directly at the small business owners in the room. The stability I possess is not subject to quarterly earnings reports, market fluctuations, or the whims of a single CEO. It is backed by the full faith and credit of the United States government. The impact was immediate and total. My father was slumped in his chair, his eyes fixed on the tablecloth, unable to look up. His shame was palpable, not just because of Vivian's insult, but because he had allowed his daughter, who managed billions in national assets, to be publicly diminished by his wife. Vivian was trembling slightly. Her eyes were darting around the room, desperately seeking an ally, a way to reclaim the narrative. But the professionals, the ones whose opinions mattered to her social standing, were looking at me with undisguised respect. They didn't see a daughter who had run off. They saw a highly educated, highly compensated, and strategically indispensable executive who had just publicly corrected a gross error in judgment. I lowered my voice slightly for the conclusion, ensuring it was a personal address, but still delivered with professional detachment. "So, Vivian," I finished, my gaze locking onto hers one last time. To suggest that I, a lieutenant commander with 2 specialized graduate degrees, managing global operations, would harbor professional jealousy toward an entry-level position that I could fund entirely with a single-month salary is not merely insulting. It is a profound failure in strategic assessment. I am not jealous. I am simply operating on a different scale of professional responsibility. I stepped back from the microphone. The job was done. The threat was neutralized. The facts were deployed, and they had won the day. I felt the surge of adrenaline receding, replaced by the cold, clear resolution of a mission accomplished. I hadn't lost my temper. I had simply leveraged my worth. I stood there for a beat, allowing the sheer weight of my statement to settle over the stunned silence of the room. I had established my position, and now I was ready for extraction. I was already planning my exit strategy. The silence that followed my final factual statement was not empty. It was dense, weighted by the sudden, inescapable reality I had introduced. It was the silence you experience after an explosion, when the ringing in your ears finally subsides and you realize the landscape has fundamentally changed. I stood there, rooted, watching the fallout spread across the faces in the room. Vivian was the epicenter of the destruction. Her carefully constructed facade had not just cracked, it had disintegrated. The saccharine smile, the weapon she wielded so effectively, was gone, replaced by a ghastly, slack-jawed expression of sheer, unadulterated defeat. Her eyes, fixed on me, held a mixture of venom and disbelief, the look of a petty tyrant whose authority has been publicly and irrefutably overthrown by a superior force. She had expected me to retreat, to shrink, to stammer a weak defense. She had certainly not expected a strategic, fact-based assault that simultaneously validated my career and quantified her own irrelevance to my world. I watched her hand tremble as she instinctively reached for the water glass, but she couldn't steady herself enough to lift it. She was utterly paralyzed. I felt the surge of adrenaline that had fueled my impromptu speech begin to recede, leaving behind a cold, clinical clarity. My job was done. The threat was neutralized. The facts were deployed, and they had won the day. I hadn't lost my temper. I had simply leveraged my worth. I stood there for a beat, allowing the sheer weight of my statement to settle over the stunned silence of the room. I had established my position, and now I was ready for extraction. I was already planning my exit strategy. The shift in the room's atmosphere was intoxicatingly satisfying. The business associates, the CFOs, and lawyers whom Vivian had tried so hard to impress were no longer looking at the errant daughter. They were looking at a lieutenant commander who managed assets in the billions, who held clearances they could only dream of achieving, and whose education was mathematically superior to their own children's debt-laden paths. I saw the rapid calculation in their eyes, the immediate professional reevaluation of my status. Suddenly, their nods were genuine, respectful, acknowledging not the relative, but the peer. It was my father, Bob, who finally broke the spell. He moved awkwardly, pushing his chair back with a scraping noise that seemed deafeningly loud. He looked utterly destroyed, his face pale with shame, not just for Vivian's behavior, but for his own decade of complicity. He stumbled toward me, his hands outstretched in a gesture that was half apology, half desperate plea. "Sarah," he mumbled, his voice thick and wavering, barely audible above the sudden, nervous chatter that erupted in the corners of the room. "I am so sorry. That was unforgivable. I should have stopped her." I looked at him, and for the first time in a long time, I saw the man beneath the passive husband, a man who was deeply ashamed of his failure to protect his child. But the emotion, though genuine, was too late. I accepted his apology with a curt professional nod. The kind of acknowledgement you give to a subordinate who has finally recognized a major procedural error. "Understood, Dad," I said, my voice flat. I didn't use his name, just the familial title, stripped of any warmth. I realized that his apology was necessary for his own integrity, not for my healing. "Don't let the noise detract from your achievement." She pulled back, her eyes glistening. "Sarah, I didn't know about everything. I'm sorry she said that." "It's irrelevant," I stated, straightening up. "The only opinions that matter are the ones based on facts, Clara. You focus on your facts." I gave her a brief, reassuring smile, a signal that this was not her burden to carry. Then I retrieved my jacket, which I had placed neatly over the back of an empty chair. The movement was deliberate, unhurried, projecting a sense of control that belied the chaos I had just created. I did not need to see Vivian try to salvage the situation, nor did I need to witness the whispered judgments from the guests. My point was made. My value was established not by their validation, but by my own earned merits. I had demonstrated that I operated on a different plane of existence, one where pettiness and spite were irrelevant, because the stakes I dealt with were too high. I paused at the entrance to the private room, surveying the wreckage of the perfect suburban dinner party. I met my father's gaze one last time. He looked like a man who had lost something irretrievable. I offered him a final professional nod, a goodbye, but also an indication that our relationship, as it stood, was permanently downgraded. Then I walked out. The air in the country club foyer was cooler, sterile. I moved quickly, my heels clicking sharply on the polished marble floor. I didn't look back. I was Lieutenant Commander Sarah, executing a clean, decisive withdrawal. The emotional battlefield of my childhood was behind me. I reached the parking lot, found my rental sedan, a bland, anonymous vehicle perfectly suited for blending into this environment, and slid into the driver's seat. The engine purred to life, a low, comforting sound of reliable machinery. I pulled out onto the manicured streets of Northern Virginia, leaving the suffocating atmosphere of the country club behind. As I drove, the tension I had held in my core for hours, for years, really, began to dissipate. The physical release was profound. I gripped the steering wheel, feeling the cool leather under my fingers, and I realized I was trembling slightly, not from fear or rage, but from the sheer expenditure of energy required to maintain that icy composure. I reflected on the word Vivian had used: jealousy. It was such a small, pathetic word, designed to diminish and categorize me as an emotional, unfulfilled woman. I laughed, a short, sharp sound that held no humor. Jealousy? Of what? Of debt? Of an entry-level position that required supervision and lacked any strategic autonomy? I thought about my office back in San Diego. I pictured the heavy, engraved plaque on my desk. Lieutenant Commander Sarah, USN. I pictured the specialized degrees hanging on the wall, the gold seal of the Naval Postgraduate School, the intricate classified diagrams required for my thesis on global supply chain vulnerabilities. Those documents weren't just diplomas, they were proof of intellectual endurance, of sacrifices made in sterile classrooms and deployment zones far from the comfort of this affluent suburb. My security clearance alone represented a level of trust and responsibility that Vivian could never comprehend. It meant the government had vetted every aspect of my life, every relationship, every financial decision, deciding that I was worthy of access to information that dictated global outcomes. Her world was defined by gossip and neighborhood politics. Mine was defined by operational readiness and strategic consequence. I looked down at my hands on the steering wheel. These hands had signed off on multi-million-dollar contracts, managed logistics for ships traversing hostile waters, and briefed four-star admirals. They were competent hands, capable hands. They were not hands meant for shaking in fear of a stepmother's passive aggression. The realization hit me with the force of a high G-turn. I no longer needed their approval. My worth wasn't tied to my father's acceptance or Vivian's malice. It was etched into the specialized degrees, the security clearance, and the medals I had earned through sheer, unyielding effort. I was a lieutenant commander, and I had just won the most satisfying battle of my life, not with force, but with absolute, cold precision. The years I had spent trying to reconcile my military self with my civilian past were over. There was no reconciliation necessary. My life was meritocratic. Theirs was superficial. I was defined by my competence, and they were defined by their compliance to social norms. As I merged onto the interstate, pointing the car south toward the distant promise of my real life, I felt a profound sense of liberation. I had finally severed the emotional anchor that kept me tethered to their judgment. The pettiness was behind me. The shame was theirs to carry. I was going back to the life where my value was measured by my performance, where my rank was respected because it was earned, and where facts, not feelings, dictated reality. I was finally, irrevocably free of the need to prove myself to them. The road ahead was dark, but it was leading me home, to the only home that truly mattered, the one I had built for myself, brick by brick, clearance by clearance, far away from the stifling weight of the khakis I no longer needed to wear to command respect. I breathed deeply, the cool night air filling my lungs. Mission accomplished. Time to report for duty. Dawn was breaking as I drove down I-95, leaving behind the domesticated lights of Northern Virginia. Each mile seemed to pluck another thread from the emotional web that dinner had tried to trap me in. In the passenger seat, my cell phone vibrated particularly. Messages that I knew, instinctively, didn't deserve my attention. Vivian was probably already piecing together some alternative narrative to salvage her trust. My father might be trying to settle his fragile guilt with empty words. Clara, she might be the only message I would truly consider reading. But not now. Now I need silence. Darkness. I needed to hear the steady, steady sound of the engine, feel the weight of the steering wheel in my hands, the grip of the tires on the damp asphalt. It was a liturgy, a purification process after the battle. As I drove away, I realized my body was still on full alert. Muscles rigid, diaphragm tight, mind racing with calculations that had nothing to do with naval logistics. The adrenaline that had fueled my surgical response in front of 50 people still pulsed like an internal echo, like a residual tremor of an earthquake. It was impressive how a room full of successful people could seem more hostile than any crisis room in the Pentagon. At least in crisis rooms, hostility had a purpose. It was tactical, calibrated, professional. What Vivian had tried to do was something far more primitive, the destruction of identity as social entertainment. And I had dismantled her operation as if I were conducting a post-action report. I took a deep breath, letting the cold morning air penetrate my lungs. The rearview mirror reflects only darkness. The world has fallen asleep, but I haven't. Sleep didn't come easily after years of training my body to respond to unexpected alerts. After long nights reviewing sensitive reports, calibrating decisions that affected the routes of military ships in the Pacific, and the delivery of equipment worth more than that entire house where Vivian reigned. I gripped the steering wheel more firmly and let my thoughts reorganize themselves naturally, as they do after an intense simulation exercise. They organized themselves in layers, like classified files. Layer 1. Operation completed. The night's objective had been simple: to represent my presence without conflict. That objective was modified, but I adapted precisely. I had responded to the aggression in a proportional, documented, unquestionable way. Layer 2. Collateral damage. Clara. Always innocent, always kept on the sidelines of her mother's psychological games. She shouldn't have seen that. But perhaps it was necessary. Perhaps it was a turning point for her to understand the true nature of the environment in which she grew up. Layer 3. Future repercussions. Vivian would never again try to humiliate me in public. Her defeat was total, unequivocal, devastating. As for my father, his silence, his cowardice, that permanent damage, there was no possible repair. I accelerated slightly. The road opened up before me like an escape route. Every second took me further away from that domestic life that never truly belonged to me. Part 2. Liberation and Recognition. When I arrived at the hotel near the airport, the parking lot was almost empty. It was one of those 24-hour hotels catering to solo travelers, military personnel in transit, conference professionals, people accustomed to temporary spaces, to lives with short routes. I feel more at home there than at any dinner table in my father's house. The lobby was silent, lit by cool lamps that cast long shadows on the carpet. The receptionist greeted me with the neutral professionalism I appreciate. No questions, no personal interest. Just efficiency. "Check in for Sarah Richardson," I said, handing over my ID. "Of course, ma'am. Will you be staying one night?" "Yes, my flight is early." He typed quickly, handed me the key, and indicated the elevator. I thanked him with a brief nod and followed. In the room, I left my suitcase on the floor and sat on the edge of the bed. It was strange to feel the firmness of the mattress after so many hours standing, after so many hours maintaining a calculated posture. I took off my shoes, dropped my blazer on the armchair, and stayed there for a moment, just listening to my own breathing. You did what I needed to do, what I wanted. I repeated this phrase mentally, not as a justification, but as a statement of fact. Vivian had attacked my name, my career, and my integrity in front of witnesses. If this were in a military setting, it would be an official report. It would be recorded, investigated. In civilian life, however, the world allowed this type of person to wage silent wars. The plane began its descent before dawn over the Pacific, and the leaden blue landscape gave way to green islands, perfect circles of coral, and the sea, a vast metallic plain reflecting the rising light. The feeling of approach always brought me to a state of almost physical focus. My senses sharpened, layers of distraction fell away, and only the problem ahead remained. Its geography, its risks, and the decisions that would need to be made in the coming hours. Upon disembarking, the military terminal was a capsule of efficiency. Men and women in various uniforms moved with a rehearsed choreography. I received the access code via an encrypted channel, meeting point at Logistics Command. A jeep took me through internal roads, between hangars and warehouses. The sound of the engine and the sun breaking the horizon served as physical barriers to the informational storm I knew awaited me. The command building had the austerity of someone who knows that every cubic centimeter holds strategic value. I sat in the designated clean room, connected my secure device, and waited for the documents to be released, forcing my mind to work within precise parameters. Deadlines, capabilities, vulnerabilities, contingencies. Within minutes, the briefing appeared, a sealed file with markings indicating an ultra classification. I opened it. The words jumped out at me with the coldness of an operational report. Interception and attempted exfiltration of sensitive equipment on a trans-Pacific route. Suspected compromise at a third-party supplier's logistics node. Possible involvement of unidentified state agents. Requires immediate assessment of chain of custody, routing alternatives, and activation of containment protocol. I read it quickly, twice, then began to break down the problem. First step, validate the intelligence. Second, ensure the integrity of the equipment. Third, secure alternatives without exposing additional resources. It was a puzzle with lives at stake, and there's always a different taste when lives can be affected. At the heart of the briefing was an item that caught my eye. Asset ID Seat XJ93, a cryptographic communications module, a small, discrete module, too valuable to fall into the hands of adversaries. If compromised, it could open channels allowing for large-scale interceptions. My team was assembled in minutes. A cyber operations officer, a supply chain manager with a background in third-party contracts, and an intelligence analyst whose specialty was creating correlations between logistical movements and border activities. Each brought their own lens, but all knew that my responsibility was to stitch everything together so that the resulting plan was robust and resilient. I called for the basic order: dependency map, single points of failure, alternative paths, execution timeline, and risk matrix. I asked for time estimates for each step and requested redundant contingencies: 2 routes, 2 custodians, 3 manual checks. Redundancy is tedious, but it's what saves operations. While the team worked, I mentally mapped out the political implications. A leak of this nature wouldn't just be a logistical incident, it would be a diplomatic crisis. We needed absolute discretion until we had irrefutable proof. And that was where the difficulty lay: acting quickly, silently, with surgical precision. I delegated tasks, allocated resources, and marked the extraction point, a nearby naval base where a discreet transport would be waiting. In parallel, I ordered contact with the third-party supplier to open a controlled negotiation channel, an operation that, if poorly conducted, could alert foreign forces. The negotiation would be a test, extracting information without exposing procedures. The clock ticked. Each movement, each call, each exchange of credentials was a knot of probability. The morning transformed into a living chessboard. At one point, while we awaited confirmation, I allowed myself a second of silence. I thought about dinner, Vivian's face, my father's expression, brief images that now occupied zero space in my decision-making. There was a liberating clarity to it. When the battlefield is real, small domestic storms lose all relevance. It wasn't contempt. It was simply a rational allocation of attention. The intelligence analyst entered the room with what felt like a weight on his jaw. "We have correlations," he said. On his screen, a pattern of logistical movements seemed to align with smaller financial transfers and abnormal inventory checks. There was an intermediary actor, a front entity, acting as a buffer between the supplier and the final channel. It was the exfiltration signature. I activated the protocol that kept the operation within legal limits, but ruthlessly effective. We issued a temporary hold order for all,